Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is JB, and I'm going to talk about Kotlin Multiplatform. I work at a company called OLX, and if you don't know OLX, we do buy and sell application. So it's like Facebook Marketplace or similar to eBay. And what we recently had was a reorg. Any of you experienced a reorg before? Okay, I see some people. Reorg basically allows you to meet new people, work with new teams, and basically allow you to try out new stuff because you are working with a new team. They have different perspectives, and they have new ideas also to bring to the team. Usually the reaction for a reorg is that people are scared. People don't know what will happen. People are expecting a lot of uncertainties, and people basically panic because the company just announced this big change and they don't know what will happen. And we experienced this recently, and I'm going to share the story that we had and also why we chose to use Kotlin Multiplatform. So let me give you some context first. There's two offices working with OLX in Europe. There's a Poznan office in Poland, and there's a Berlin office. So the Berlin office is doing shared services, similar to a platform team from other companies. So basically, what you are doing, everyone else is using. And then the Poznan team is doing the actual application, the iOS and Android applications. This is before the reorg, and after the reorg, basically both teams were asked to work on the same application. And also Berlin still handles the shared services. And let me just show you what OLX looks like. This is what the application looks like. It's basically eBay or Facebook Marketplace, but for European markets and some other emerging economy markets. And this is how the team looks like. So in Poznan office and in Berlin office, there is a person that acts like a kind of a lead. And in Poznan, he's an Android developer purely, and in Berlin is an iOS and Android developer, which is me. And then we have several developers in Poznan and in Berlin, much more in Berlin, and we are divided into several packs, similar to the Spotify model. So in Poznan, there's like 3 packs, and in Berlin, there's like 5. So you can imagine the sort of communication that you would have to go through if the team has rearranged in a different way. Now they have to work together in 2 different offices. And as you can see here, there's like a weird arrangement of people. In pack 1, you can notice like there's 2 Android developers and no iOS. Why is there no iOS developer there? Are they expecting not to release their features in iOS and only on Android? And you'll also notice some weird stuff like this. Why is there no basically Android person on pack 3 and no iOS person on pack 8? And also several different questions like why is there only one person in this pack? Are they expecting this developers to do the work of both people? And then the work that they asked us to do was to move from the old API, which I can basically describe as like a big ball of mud of code, and move to the new API, which is also a ball of mud, but a little bit shinier. And if you look at the code, you'll see that the logs will, the commit dates will show that most of the code were made like 2 years ago, and some of the codes like 4 years ago. So this code is really old, and I would consider it basically legacy. And most of the stuff doesn't have any patterns. They were made a really long time ago, and you wouldn't really expect to work on this code on day 1, and you really have to know what's happening there. And also, there isn't a lot of documentation here, so any change that you will do will probably break stuff, or you would probably ask someone who knows someone who knows someone that worked on this code before you can work on this. This is a mess. And again, going back to the team structure, let's focus on the pack 4, which is one of the teams handling the posting flow, where you're trying to sell items. One approach here is to basically divide yourself and work double the time if you're going to make both, or do it sequentially like normal people. For example, if you're going to make a feature, for example, moving the posting form from the old API to the new API, you can basically start working on iOS first, and then Android. And then you can see the time frame below. Or you can do it the other way around, which is Android first and then iOS, which is basically the same amount of time. But if you think about it, it's the same feature, so why not share some code between Android and iOS? So here comes Kotlin Multiplatform. So ideally, this is what will happen. If you use Kotlin Multiplatform on Android, and you start working on the iOS as a single developer that's working on both platforms, you can basically save this amount of time. And if you have several different features that you are doing, you can basically multiply this amount of time saved and effort saved. And so it only makes sense to use Kotlin Multiplatform, ideally. And that's why we started to introduce to OLX the Kotlin Multiplatform approach. But let's step back for a while and think. We are Android or iOS developers, and we are using Kotlin and or Swift. And basically, I heard from the talks yesterday that not all companies are using Swift or Kotlin totally in their code. So you still have some Java there, or you still have some Objective-C. And now you start to look at Kotlin Multiplatform. It's like a new check out there. So you're not really focusing on your priorities here. And once you see a new approach or like a new architecture, of course, you are excited. There's a lot of new possibilities that can happen, a lot of great stuff that you can do. But also, there are some risks, there's some concerns, uncertainty and resistance. Resistance mainly coming from the team, which is not yet familiar with the approach. Uncertainty, for example, if you're using beta software, then you'll probably have some bugs, or you'll probably have some issues fixing those bugs or figuring out how to fix those bugs. And the risk, of course, is that you will break stuff if you switch to this new approach. Let me give you a familiar example of moving from Java to Kotlin. If you moved from Java to Kotlin, then you would experience some issues, like when you convert a parcelable from Java to parcelable in Kotlin, and then the automatic converter messes up and it suddenly swaps out the order of stuff, then you'll probably break the parcelable serialization and deserialization, because you basically have different classes now. And the data that is currently cached in the devices was from Java, and if you read it from Kotlin, your app will crash. Those are some of the concerns that you would have if you move from Java to Kotlin. Another issue if you move from Java to Kotlin is that developers are not familiar with Kotlin initially, if you just started. So you would have to educate them all how to use this, the common stuff, the best practices. Of course, they're looking for that. This is similar to all existing concepts and new concepts. If you try to introduce a new concept, your team would have to determine the risks, concerns, uncertainties, and resistance. And you would have to basically onboard everyone to get them familiar with this. And giving the example of this, if you move from the native iOS and Android approach to having this bigger stack with Kotlin Multiplatform in it, then you would have to deal with this same problem as well. And we have experienced this, and of course, we are going to share what we've learned. So the results of our trials was that in Android, it was fairly straightforward to introduce Kotlin Multiplatform, and currently it's running in production. But in iOS, it's an ongoing conversation with them to try and gain consensus with the team. There's a lot of concerns, And I also have the same concern as them. And it's not totally worth the effort of releasing this in production yet. But we are using this internally. So I'm going to show like how we are using this internally without really using it in production, but somehow still using it in iOS. So going here, the OLX app right now has Kotlin Multiplatform in it. And we started with Android first. If your application is not yet divided into modules, I would advise that you start now because it makes it easier. If you're going to this approach of Kotlin Multiplatform, then you would need to create a module for Kotlin Multiplatform. As you can see there, it's posting_MPP. And basically, this allows you to separate the configuration for Kotlin Multiplatform separate from your main code. Basically, where you have to compile your code into native, and then you cannot have dependencies that depend on Android, because if you're using Kotlin Multiplatform, of course you have to use only Kotlin libraries. And this is how it looks like. The application depends on the posting module and the posting UI module. And both of these two modules depend on the posting multiplatform module. So given this structure of code in your project, I started two PRs in the application. One is to refactor the posting form, which is basically to take out all the code that is in the application module and then move it to the posting module, and then prepare it for A/B testing, or well, it's a feature flag, so that you can switch between the old approach and the new approach. But the Kotlin Multiplatform was not yet there. And then after that was merged, then we used Ktor and the Kotlin Multiplatform models, which is using Kotlin serialization, and basically have a separate PR for this. So this was the plan. So first was to onboard the Android devs with Kotlin Multiplatform approach, which happened fairly straightforward. There was a workshop, several people attended, also some iOS people there, but not all the iOS people attended. And then move to Kotlin serialization, which allows you to use your models from Android into iOS as well, and then to add Ktor later on, which will allow you to perform networking operations. And then this is where we stopped, but the plan was, if ever this approach would work, then we would move forward to adding SQL Delight for the persistence layer, and shared view models for mapping the domain data into the views, but not directly actually using the UI, because I think, as Jeremy Rempel from yesterday said, it's better to use the native approach for the UI layer, because it allows you to actually use the platform to the fullest extent. And of course, the rest of the code that you can put in common. So that's Android. And when we move to iOS, this is where the difficulty comes from. So first, I started a PR, which was to move one of the endpoints for location, selecting location in posting, into the new API. And then this also introduced some Kotlin multiplatform code. So what happened was I closed it, because there's so many comments and a lot of resistance from the iOS team. I didn't really want to force the Kotlin multiplatform approach yet. So this was one of the test beds for trying out what the feedback of the iOS team was. One of their comments was that they don't have control over Kotlin code. As iOS developers, purely iOS developers, they are not familiar with Kotlin. They haven't used Kotlin. I think they have no desire to learn Kotlin yet. And of course, yeah, I've mentioned they don't have knowledge of Kotlin or Kotlin X. And then another question in their mind was, can we run tests? Which is a basic question. But actually, if they listen to the workshop that I did, then they would know that, of course, you can run tests both on Android and iOS at the same time, or not at the same time. You would run the test once, write the test once, and then it will run for both Android and iOS. And then, of course, we answer these questions in the PR, but it all comes to them to decide if they would accept the answer or not. And then they are asking if this is a transition from native development from Swift to Kotlin. From this comment, it seems that the developers are really scared of losing ownership in their code, losing control over what they are developing. And what is in their mind was that, are they going to wait for some person in Android to develop their models or their networking layer code until they can work on something? And if there is an issue, they would have to ask that person, and they cannot do anything. This is a real concern. But of course, there are several ways to handle this. Another concern that they had was that Ktor multiplatform is marked as experimental. So Ktor itself is not experimental, but Ktor multiplatform is. This is a big concern if you want to release Kotlin multiplatform in production. You would basically expect bugs in your code. This is true. I accept this comment from them, and I told them, so why not use Ktor yet and still use the native NS URL session in iOS or any other libraries that they are using. And then they have concerns about coupling and syncing, which I mentioned before. If you have a team working to develop your models and networking code and other common code, you would basically have to sync with them, ask them, oh, I need to add this thing on the model, and wait for them to implement that before you can do anything. So this adds some overhead in your team communication. So the answer to this was write a more detailed request for comments PR, which just contained everything that answers the questions. And the result of that was, of course, another PR and a lot more comments. Another question that came up from them was that, are there bigger projects working and using Kotlin multiplatform in production? The answer here was that I couldn't find anything big enough for their desire. So I only linked to them several conference applications, and we've also released an internal application for conferences that uses Kotlin multiplatform, and that was still not enough for the team. But of course, that's not really a question that is required for you to adopt this approach. If you really want to wait for something big to come out in production, then you are either late or you are really not trying out new stuff. And then they also have concerns about the learning curve. And I've also experienced this. When I started with Kotlin multiplatforms, there were several issues starting, lots of errors that I don't know how to solve, and a lot of Googling involved, and a lot of reading Slack and asking in the Slack channel for the Kotlin Slack group what to do. And also still, they have no control over Kotlin code, which is something that I cannot fix on my own. This is something that they have to also learn. If they want to basically work with the Kotlin multiplatform code and not just wait, they would have to learn Kotlin as well, or just accept the fact that there's another team that would handle the common code, and then they would just have to communicate, which is less work for them. I don't know why they don't want to have less work, but basically it seems like they really want control over the code. And also fear of bugs, because Kotlin multiplatform is still in beta. Most of the libraries are in beta, so there would be bugs. And another concern was debugging, which I forgot to put in the RFC, but it's an easy answer that some people are developing an Xcode plugin for debugging. I think Kevin Galligan was developing this for TouchLab, and you can basically check out GitHub, which will be linked later on here. And then there's performance concerns. Will this slow our app down? How much will it slow it down? How big will it make the app? How much bigger will it make the app? And several other concerns. So the answer was to limit the scope of the RFC to only a few, a limited feature where you're not affecting the whole application, so your concerns are smaller, and therefore you can try out this stuff, ideally. And then also to gather support from the Android developers, because the iOS people are looking for people who will actually maintain the common code. They were not sure that if we start using Kotlin Multiplatform, that there would be someone to handle their concerns, which is the Android developers. And then this is what came out of it. More people approved the PR. So there's actually 2 people approved. But with all the people who can do iOS in the team, the 3 did not approve yet. And I closed this because it was really blocking us from actually pushing this feature into production. And the result of this was that the comments said the scope was too small for this. Basically, we limited the scope to just the models and serialization of the models back and forth. No networking, no other stuff. And for them, that was too small to try out this approach. It was not a real use case for Kotlin Multiplatform. And so you can see that there's like a back and forth of, oh, we have this new approach. Here are our concerns. We try to fix it. And then they come up with new stuff. It seems that from this, the team is really not ready for this kind of approach. At least the iOS team is not ready. And so what happened was we just closed the PR, but of course, we still used Kotlin Multiplatform internally. Another concern was that the interoperability from Kotlin to iOS was not, or Swift and Objective-C was not smooth. They think it was not smooth, but we explained it several times. Me and the rest of the Android developers were explaining that when you compile it to native, it basically is a native class or a native object, which just had Objective-C headers, but it's basically the same. They also had concerns on memory, thread, and error management. About memory, we found a note in Kotlin native repository that says memory management for the classes or objects is different from iOS. So it's not the same as the automatic reference counting in iOS. It has its own garbage collection, basically like Java. So there's a small part of the Kotlin native engine that is cleaning up the code and handling the memory stuff. And then threading, as I've read in multiple sources, there's no threading yet. So concurrency is still an ongoing discussion for Kotlin Multiplatform. You cannot use it in multiple threads. You can use it on the main thread. So if you want to use Kotlin Multiplatform, you can only use it in the main thread for now, at least as I've checked yesterday. And then error management. If you have exceptions in your Kotlin code, will you be able to catch them in the iOS part of your application? The answer is yes. And I just had to add it in the IRC so that they can understand how it works. An interesting thing here is that the people who approved the PR was iOS and Android developers. I mean, they can do both. And they understand the advantages of this approach because they have done both. And one of the people who liked it was an Android developer. But there's also several comments supporting this approach from the Android developers. They just didn't click anything in the buttons. So the next step here was to continue with multi-platform on Android, of course, because they have accepted it, and then only to use it internally for iOS. What I mean by internally is that we have our Swift Objective-C iOS application, the native one, and then we have the Kotlin multi-platform code coming from Android, which contains the models, models to domain mappers, interfaces, and the network calls. And the approach was to actually use it for iOS. So, and then, so you can actually try out if your feature works. So you basically finish a feature using the Kotlin multi-platform approach, and then you basically try to hide the Kotlin multi-platform code, or not hide, replace it with native code. So, there's a point that you are using Kotlin multi-platform, and then you start removing it one by one. You would have to move each of them to Swift, so or Objective-C. So you would have at the end all the same things move to native Swift, and then at the end, essentially, you can remove the Kotlin multi-platform code so that the iOS developers are quite confident that everything is native Swift. I don't know why the screen is blinking. I'm just trying to fix it. So at the end, you can remove the Kotlin multi-platform code, and you've used it just to start your feature, and internally you've used it, and then basically the interfaces look the same. The classes would look the same, and later in the future, when the approach is accepted by the whole team, and there's not much resistance anymore, then you can continue on again with using Kotlin multi-platform for the common code, and you can just basically swap them out. So these are the learnings from the team. We also had technical learnings working with the Kotlin multi-platform code. One of them was some limitations of the Kotlin multi-platform approach that exists currently right now. An example is if you're using mapping from strings to enum for Kotlin serialization, you'll get an error that says this class does not contain the element with name new, for example, which new is a string. And if you see the class, the enum that I've declared here, they're in all caps, the enum, and then there's an annotation that says this is the name for serialization, which is in lowercase. This is a limitation right now for Kotlin serialization that says the serial annotation doesn't have any effect right now, and it's going to be fixed in the future. So what I can basically do is just to rename the enums to lowercase. But of course, if you didn't know that at the start, you pull out your hairs and start to figure out like, why is this thing not working? Where is this documented? I don't know what this error means. So there's a lot of these things when you start using this approach. Another thing is when you access things in the main thread, for example, this one, illegal attempt to access non-shared class from the other thread. What this means is you're trying to use a class from Kotlin multi-platform in a non-main thread in iOS, which is not allowed right now. You can either freeze the object so you can access it, or you can just use the main thread for all your operations over these objects. So this concurrency is still an issue, of course, in Kotlin multi-platform. And if you really want to use it in asynchronous operations, you would basically have to wait for the team or to contribute to the Kotlin multi-platform effort and fix these concurrency issues. And there are several resources below the slide trying to explain why this thing works like this and why it doesn't work on the other threads. I've mentioned earlier that error handling is an issue for the iOS developers that they didn't know. For example, if you had a method that says Kotlin method throws, or for example, Kotlin method throws with the string argument, does it translate to iOS? Does it translate to Objective-C or Swift? Basically, the answer is yes. If you have a version above that that is described in this screenshot, you can basically convert the throws annotation from Kotlin multi-platform into an error in iOS. So it would be an NS error, and then if you use Swift, it would be an exception in Swift. So you can basically catch the errors coming from Kotlin multi-platform in iOS. But there's also some weird things going on there, which I will not go into. But in short, basically, I would say that it works, but has some caveats, which I will not go into. And then another question was, if the project is not monorepo, if you don't have Android and iOS code in the same repository, how do you work together? How do you use the Kotlin multi-platform code? Usually, what you do is add a script to iOS that would compile the Kotlin multi-platform code. And every time you build your iOS code, it will run the script. It will generate the frameworks that you have, that you generate from the Kotlin code, and then you can basically refer to the framework. But if you don't have a monorepo, then it would be a problem. But you have CocoaPods, actually. So if you use the CocoaPods plugin from Gradle, then you can generate a framework, and then you can just refer to a pod spec. If you're not an iOS developer, don't worry, this is not Android. This is a different thing. So in iOS, you can use your Kotlin multi-platform code using the CocoaPod dependency, which you don't need to, it doesn't need to exist in the same repo. It can be in another repo, and then you can just refer to it, like Gradle. You can just add like implementation, and then refer to the name of the package. And then if you start using Kotlin multi-platform and follow the tutorial online, you will only see 64-bit support. But of course, you still have to support 32-bit devices. And there is a solution for this. It's not that clear in the documentation, but there are several sources citing that how you can do it. So you basically declare ARM32, ARM64, and x64 support. So this is phone, and then laptop. So you basically generate 3 binaries, and then you combine them together into what's called a FAT framework, which exists as a Gradle task. I'm really annoyed at this flashing thing, but never mind. So with this FAT framework script, you can basically have one framework that has all of them, and then you can ship this thing in production if you are willing. And of course, if you're shipping this in production, you're looking for the debugging symbols in iOS. So these are called DSIM files, and they're only generated for debug right now. And there is an open PR that asks where is the DSIM for released builds, which currently doesn't exist. And if you want to release this in production, then you would have to wait or, of course, contribute to this. And coroutines, does it work in iOS? The answer is no. Well, it kind of does. You would have to declare something that wraps the coroutine into a coroutine scope, and then it would basically just launch it on the main thread, because Kotlin multi-platform just works on the main thread for now. This is the snippet of the code that does it for you. I think I won't go into this, but basically you're declaring a scope, and then you run your suspending function inside of this scope, and then just use a callback for iOS, because iOS, when you compile your Kotlin multi-platform code, the suspend functions don't translate; they disappear. So you basically have to use callbacks. And yeah, this is the second part of that, and I don't need to explain what this does, but I basically already did. So what's next for our team? We plan to do more workshops for Kotlin multi-platform internally, so that we can basically onboard everyone, even the iOS developers who are reluctant of this approach. And then we would ask them to pair together, iOS and Android. If you're working on the same feature, of course, you will be doing the same thing. You will be sharing knowledge. Why not pair program together? And you can basically also learn the other platform from them. So Android learns iOS, iOS learns Android if they want. And of course, if the team just really wants to wait for large companies to adopt, then we would have to wait. But this is up to us. And of course, what can you do? In your team, if you want to start this approach, the advice would be to introduce the concepts first before trying out anything. You would have to make the team really familiar with how it works, with all the concerns that we had here. You would basically have to lay out everything for them, because I'm pretty sure they would have the same questions as my team had, and you would have to answer them as we've answered them, and just really have to prepare them. And then you make an RFC, and then make them familiar with both approaches, and pair them as well, and make your efforts public, because people are looking for other people doing this, and not a lot of things are public yet, so it will really help if your efforts is public. And you can also help improve the tooling. So that's it. You can also look at another talk, Working Across Platforms, by Christina Lee, I think in 20 minutes or something. And this is OLX. We are present in almost all the whole world, except those that are not shaded. And these are the brands that are in the same family. And these are our offices. And if you have any questions, I'm just right here. Or you can email me or tweet to me. Yes, that is it. Thank you very much.